Welcome to The Explainer. Whenever we think about the First World War, our minds almost immediately jump to those muddy, stagnant trenches on the Western Front, right? But today, we are going to unravel the massive historical chess match of World War I's naval warfare. We're pulling back the curtain on an entirely different battlefield, one filled with dreadnoughts, invisible blockades, and unseen terrors lurking right beneath the waves.
Okay, let's dive into this. Did a hidden war at sea actually decide World War I? Well, while millions of soldiers were locked in a grinding stalemate on land, a much more fluid and honestly equally decisive economic and strategic war was happening across the global oceans. This wasn't just about sinking ships. It was a battle for supply lines, for food, and literally for the survival of entire nations. Because think about it, without a victory at sea, neither side could even hope to sustain their armies on land.
Section 1. Britain's Invisible Naval Blockade. To really grasp how this whole conflict spiraled out of control, we need to look at the very beginning of what we'll call the escalation loop. Back in August 1914, Britain's primary goal was brutally simple: economically starve the German war machine.
And this brilliantly illustrates the stark strategic divide between the two navies. The British Royal Navy, boasting the largest fleet in the world, set up what's known as a far blockade. They basically parked themselves at the distant entrances to the North Sea, smartly avoiding the dangerous mine-filled coastal waters. On the flip side, the German Imperial Navy was heavily outnumbered. They knew they couldn't just face the British head-on, so their initial plan was a dangerous game of cat and mouse, trying to lure small pieces of the massive British fleet into traps to defeat them in detail.
This British blockade acted like an invisible noose around Germany's economy. The numbers here show an incredible decline. By 1918, German imports had absolutely plummeted, down to just 20% of their pre-war volume. I mean, we're not just talking about military shortages here. This caused massive civilian starvation. Without fertilizer or imported food, things got so desperate it led to the devastating turnip winter of 1916 to 1917, where potato crops completely failed and the German public was forced to survive on animal fodder.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Battle of Jutland. All of that crushing economic and social pressure from the blockade, it finally forced the German high seas fleet to make a desperate attempt to break out in May 1916.
The sheer scale of what happened next is just mind-boggling. Winston Churchill actually described the British Grand Fleet as scores of gigantic castles of steel wending their way across the misty, shining sea. It paints such a vivid picture of these massive dreadnoughts and pre-dreadnoughts steaming into action. But here's the crazy part. The Germans had no idea that British intelligence in Room 40 had already intercepted their radio codes, and they got them thanks to a drowned German sailor who washed up on a Russian beach. So the British Grand Fleet was already on its way to meet them in what would be the only major fleet-on-fleet action of the entire war.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the opening phase played out. Vice Admiral David Beatty ended up engaging the Germans in a direct slugging match, instead of using his battlecruiser's superior speed to his advantage. Because these specific ships were lightly armored to prioritize that speed, the German gunnery just ripped right through them. In a terrifyingly short amount of time, 3 British battlecruisers suffered catastrophic magazine explosions and vanished beneath the waves, prompting Beatty's famously grim remark, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today."
So, when the smoke finally cleared after Jutland, what was the result? Well, both sides claimed victory. Tactically, Germany definitely inflicted more damage. Britain lost 14 ships and over 6,000 men, compared to Germany's 11 ships and 3,000 men. But strategically, it was a massive British victory. The German fleet was forced to retreat back to port, and they never sallied forth in full strength to challenge the British Grand Fleet again. That meant the blockade remained entirely intact.
Moving on to Section 3, the Unrestricted U-boat campaign. Let's see how this escalation builds. With their surface fleet completely bottled up and starvation setting in at home, Germany turned to a terrifying unseen predator, the U-boat.
Now let's walk through this timeline because this submarine war became a seriously delicate diplomatic tightrope. Early on, in May 1915, a German U-boat sank the British ocean liner RMS Lusitania. This was a huge shock. 1,198 people died, including 128 Americans. The international outrage was deafening. Terrified of pulling the United States into the war, Germany temporarily halted these attacks, culminating in the Sussex Pledge of 1916 to spare passenger ships. But by February 1917, desperate to break that blockade, Germany threw caution to the wind, gambled everything on starvation tactics, and resumed unrestricted submarine warfare.
So the crucial point is understanding exactly why they made this ruthless shift. We have to look at the traditional prize rules of naval warfare. Before this, a submarine was supposed to surface, stop a merchant ship, and let the crew evacuate before sinking it. But think about it. A surface submarine is incredibly fragile. Just one shot from a hidden gun on a merchant ship could doom it. To survive and actually be effective, the U-boat had to totally abandon those old rules of honor and become an ambush predator, striking from the shadows without any warning at all.
And that brings us to Section 4, Convoys and Evolving Tactics. Germany's U-boat fleet exploded in size, growing from just 31 operational boats at the start of the war in 1914 to a massive 140 by 1917. They were now threatening to completely cut off Britain's food supply.
860,000. I want you to just let that massive number sink in for a second. That right there is the peak tonnage of Allied shipping sunk in just one single month, April 1917. This campaign of maritime destruction was totally unprecedented. The British were losing ships way faster than they could build them, bringing the island nation dangerously, terrifyingly close to the brink of defeat.
Before 1917, the British Admiralty was trying literally everything to hunt down these subs. One of the most fascinating early tactics they came up with was the Q-ship deception. Basically, they took heavily armed naval vessels and meticulously disguised them as helpless civilian merchant ships. When a U-boat surfaced to demand surrender under those old prize rules, the Q-ship's crew would suddenly drop the disguise, unveil their heavy guns, and blast the submarine out of the water. It was incredibly clever and accounted for the majority of the 10 U-boats sunk in the early campaign. But ultimately, it just wasn't enough to stop the bleeding.
The real salvation came from a dramatic shift in strategy, moving from offensive hunting to defensive convoys. Instead of sailing alone as sitting ducks, merchant ships were grouped together and surrounded by a protective screen of naval destroyers. They used zigzag patterns to throw off torpedo aim and deployed newly invented depth charges. The results? Absolutely staggering. Between March and May 1917, 99.78% of ships and convoys arrived safely. The kill ratio of merchant ships to U-boats plummeted from 167 to 1 all the way down to just 16 to 1.
But they didn't just defend from the surface. The British brilliantly integrated the skies into their strategy too. They established these spiderweb aerial patrols using flying boats and kite balloons to spot U-boats from above. If a submarine tried to surface to find a convoy, the aircraft would force it right back down underwater. This completely neutralized the U-boat's ability to track targets or aim torpedoes. It was a true masterclass in early multi-domain warfare.
Which leads us to Section 5. America enters the Great War. Now we're about to see the ultimate, world-changing consequence of Germany's desperate escalation. The United States gets dragged directly into the conflict.
See, Germany's ruthless submarine offensive might have solved one problem for them, but it created a fatal new one. The sheer brutality of unrestricted submarine warfare, which was sinking neutral ships right alongside British ones, dragged an emerging industrial giant across the Atlantic directly into the fight. President Woodrow Wilson had actually just won re-election on the incredibly popular slogan, "He kept us out of war." But maintaining neutrality became impossible. American citizens were dying on torpedoed ships. Plus, the U.S. had massive economic ties to the Allies, trade had doubled, and Wall Street had loaned billions to Britain and France. Throw in the infamous Zimmermann telegram, where Germany proposed an alliance with Mexico against the U.S., and Wilson was forced to act. In April 1917, America officially declared war on Germany.
So it all comes down to this ultimate strategic dilemma, and I want you to really ponder this. Was the unrestricted U-boat campaign a tragic, foolish German miscalculation that doomed them by bringing America into the fight? Or, being choked to death by a relentless British blockade, was it literally the only desperate, rational gamble they had left to try and win the war? Whatever side you take, one thing is absolutely undeniable. The war at sea, taking place far away from those muddy trenches, was the true engine of escalation that ultimately decided the fate of the First World War. Think about that the next time you look out at the ocean. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning history.